I've always believed that libraries hold more than books. They hold silences, shadows, and secrets no one dares speak aloud. That night, as I walked through the doors of an old, imposing building, I realized I wasn't just entering a place for reading, but a labyrinth of enigmas carefully hidden among dusty bookshelves. There was something different in the air, an invisible weight that followed me with every step. It wasn't just the disappearance of a rare book that had brought me there. It was the feeling that every aisle, every shelf, and every averted glance carried a message that only I could decipher. And when mystery and logic collide, there's always a price to pay. Throughout the investigation, I discovered that the greatest threat isn't always in the hands of the criminal, but in the minds of those who dare follow their leads. Because believe me, some games aren't meant to be won. They exist only to test how far we can go before our own certainties turn against us. And now I ask you, are you subscribed to this channel to follow every detail of this investigation? If not, subscribe, like, and share your opinion in the comments. This helps the mystery reach more people, and ensures you don't miss the next stories I have to tell. As soon as I stepped onto those marble stairs, I sensed this was no ordinary library. The building seemed to breathe with me, as if it held secrets it didn't wish to reveal. The heavy doors creaked, echoing in the silence in an almost ceremonial way. The smell of dust and ancient wood enveloped me like a silent warning. Nothing here was out of place by accident. It was as if I were about to cross an invisible border. I walked down the central hallway, each step exaggeratedly loud, as if my own shoes were giving me away. The walls were lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, so high they made the space seem infinite. Yellowish lights dimly illuminated the room, creating dancing shadows that stretched across the shelves. It felt like I was in a temple, not a book depository. Something told me that in that silence, even secrets whispered to each other. The reception area was empty, and emptiness always has much to say. An antique desk sat in the center, with an open ledger waiting for a signature that never arrived. The curious thing was that, even alone, I felt eyes on me, as if invisible pages were turning just to observe me. I took a deep breath, maintaining my composure, but my instincts warned that library didn't want me there as a visitor. I was being tested from the very first second. As I approached the main wing, I noticed a seemingly insignificant detail, a window half open, letting a cold breeze into the room. Strange, an ancient library, filled with fragile works, would never allow something like that to happen. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, or worse, deliberately left a trail. And in that instant, I realized that my job there wouldn't just be to retrieve a book, but to decipher a greater enigma. It was the curator who broke the silence, almost whispering, as if afraid the walls would hear. A rare book had disappeared, a unique copy by an enigmatic author whose name was already steeped in legend. According to her, the volume was not only valuable, but also contained marginal notes written by the author himself. I didn't need any further details to understand. This was no ordinary theft. Someone had planned every move. She handed me a rusty key, which opened the room where the book was supposed to be. Curiously, the lock showed no signs of forced entry, no brute force. Everything was intact, as if the book had simply vanished from the shelves. This disturbed me deeply, because perfect thefts don't happen by chance. There's always a logic to it, even if hidden behind layers of illusion. As I examined the previous night's logs, I noticed nothing unusual had been noted. No strange visitors, no suspicious noises, no unusual movements. But I knew the real mystery lay not in what was recorded, but in what was omitted. It was like putting together a puzzle. The most important pieces aren't the ones on the table, but the ones someone hid from the player. Holding that key in my hands, I had the feeling it wasn't just opening a physical door, but a much larger enigma. The curator avoided my gaze, as if carrying a secret she didn't dare confess. And deep down, I sensed the missing book wasn't just absent, it was being used. For what? That was the question echoing inside my head as I prepared to take the next step. The disappearance of this book could not be dismissed as a mere theft, and the motive soon became clear. The author, a 19th century philosopher, was known for his obscure works and a life shrouded in mystery. Some said he hid secret messages in his texts, coded instructions capable of manipulating decisions and even predicting human behavior. The idea that someone would have access to this in the 21st century was disturbing, to say the least. Leafing through old records, I discovered that the missing book had been mentioned in letters exchanged between collectors. In one, The sender claimed the copy was a manual for the perfect crime, but no one took it seriously. Until now, this legend began to take on more realities with the sudden disappearance. It was as if an ancient story had crossed time to manifest itself in the present, choosing this exact moment. The work's importance lay not only in its pages, but in the interpretations it allowed. Many scholars believed the philosopher had tested ideas of psychological manipulation before Freud was even born. Others swore he described methods of logical reasoning so advanced they could be applied to military strategy. It was both fascinating and dangerous at the same time, like holding a lit match to a barrel of gunpowder. The most intriguing detail, however, was this. The book had always been on display, protected, but never locked away, and yet no one dared touch it. The respect or fear surrounding that work was greater than any protective glass. Now, without its physical presence, I wondered, who would dare break this silent pact? And more importantly, with what intention? The disappearance of this book could not be dismissed as a mere theft, and the motive soon became clear. The author, a 19th-century philosopher, was known for his obscure works in a life shrouded in mystery. Some said he hid secret messages in his texts, coded instructions capable of manipulating decisions and even predicting human behavior. The idea that someone would have access to this in the 21st century was disturbing, to say the least. Leafing through old records, I discovered that the missing book had been mentioned in letters exchanged between collectors. In one, the sender claimed the copy was a manual for the perfect crime, but no one took it seriously. Until now, this legend began to take on more realities with the sudden disappearance. It was as if an ancient story had crossed time to manifest itself in the present, choosing this exact moment. The work's importance lay not only in its pages, but in the interpretations it allowed. Many scholars believed the philosopher had tested ideas of psychological manipulation before Freud was even born. Others swore he described methods of logical reasoning so advanced they could be applied to military strategy. It was both fascinating and dangerous at the same time, like holding a lit match to a barrel of gunpowder. The most intriguing detail, however, was this. The book had always been on display, protected, but never locked away, and yet no one dared touch it. The respect or fear surrounding that work was greater than any protective glass. Now, without its physical presence, I wondered, who would dare break this silent pact? And more importantly, with what intention? The door to the special room seemed to have come from another century. Solid wood, antique hardware, and a padlock that looked more like decoration than protection. I turned the rusty key and the click echoed too loudly, like thunder in the silence. Upon entering, I was greeted by a cold, almost sepulchral space, where time seemed to stand still. The air was heavy, thick with dust, and it felt as if no one had set foot there for decades. At first glance, nothing was out of place. The shelves were lined, the books were in order, the tables were too clean for a space supposedly forgotten, and yet the empty space where the book should have been stared at me like an open wound. It was as if that absence held more presence than any object around it. Everything seemed carefully arranged, perhaps too arranged, as if someone had set the scene to deceive me. I examined the inside of the lock and confirmed what I already suspected. No signs of tampering, no scratches, no pressure marks, absolutely nothing. This meant whoever took the book had legitimate access, or at the very least, knew the lock as well as I knew my own pockets. This detail ruled out a random thief and narrowed the circle of suspects. There was a calculating mastermind behind the act. What intrigued me most was an almost imperceptible detail. A uniform layer of dust covered the shelves, except for a thin line next to the empty space, as if a hand had rested there to reach the book. A small mark, a banal gesture, but it revealed presence. It confirmed that the disappearance was no illusion. Someone had touched the forbidden, and now I needed to find out who had dared to break this silent pact. I decided to consult the library catalog, a relic of yellowed pages that kept records of the works like a diary of memory. The missing book was there, duly annotated, but next to the title I found strange symbols scrawled by hand. They weren't simple errors or identifying marks. They seemed like codes, fragments of a riddle someone had left intentionally, almost like an invisible signature. As I analyzed the symbols, I realized they followed a logical pattern, like a mathematical sequence mixed with ancient letters. It wasn't the kind of thing a typical librarian would use to organize shelves. It felt like a masked message, meant for anyone with the patience to decipher it. And I knew that in cases like this, nothing happens by chance. Every detail has the function of either distracting or revealing. I showed the catalog to the curator, and her reaction was immediate. She paled, slammed the book shut, and said it meant nothing. But people only reject so vehemently what they actually know very well. With her every gesture, my instincts confirmed that the mystery wasn't just the book's physical disappearance, but also the reason someone wanted to conceal clues in official record. As I flipped through the pages again, I noticed other books also had similar small markings. However, only the missing copy carried a complete sequence, as if it were the key to a larger puzzle. It was clear I was dealing with someone who loved mental challenges, someone who wanted to provoke me. The question was this person playing me, or leading me exactly where he wanted to go? Every investigation begins to take shape when faces, stories, and intentions emerge. In the case of the library, 3 figures immediately caught my attention. The first was the librarian, a meticulous man known for his almost unhealthy obsession with the order of the shelves. He knew each book as well as someone who knows their own children, and precisely for this reason, his profile intrigued me. Could he betray the logic he so revealed? The second piece of this puzzle was a young, curious literature student, often seen prowling the hallways at night. Her eyes sparkled when she spoke of ancient authors, but there was something restless in her manner, as if she were seeking more than knowledge, a revelation perhaps, or even proof that she belonged to something greater. People like this, driven by insatiable curiosity, often cross dangerous lines without realizing it. The third suspect was an enigmatic collector, a silent regular at the library, wealthy, reserved, and always willing to finance restorations. He rarely spoke about his true interests. His gaze roamed the shelves not like someone who loves books, but like someone considering prizes to be won. This kind of coldness bothers me, because it hides a clear motivation: power, and power almost always goes hand in hand with well-planned crimes. As I observed each of them, I began to piece together psychological profiles that resembled chess pieces on an ancient board. Each had possible motivations, and all had access to the space of disappearance. It wasn't just a matter of opportunity, but of criminal intent, and I knew that, at some point, the true culprit would let slip a tiny detail, an involuntary gesture, that would reveal more than 1,000 testimony. It was when I decided to return to the scene that something unexpected caught my attention: a black feather, resting discreetly among the shelves. It made no sense at all. Libraries aren't places crows usually enter, much less leave such specific trail. I picked up the feather carefully, as if holding a silent note. There was the first physical trace, a concrete sign that someone had left a veiled message. I examined the feather against the dim light of the room. It was long, shiny, and well preserved, unlike mere wind-blown dirt. With each investigation, I learned to respect details that seem trivial. Objects like these can be coincidences, or invitations. The fact is, amidst so much silence, that feather screamed, and more than that, it seemed to challenge me to decipher its true purpose. When I showed the find to the curator, she paled again. She said none of it made sense, but her look betrayed something different. The feather wasn't new to her, it was recognition, and I already knew, when someone pretends not to see the obvious, it's because they fear the consequences of what might be revealed. The question wasn't just what that feather meant, but why it was being hidden. I decided to keep it in my pocket, like someone holding a key to a still locked safe. I didn't know if the feather was a clue, a provocation, or simple irony, but I was certain it was part of something bigger, perhaps a code, perhaps a symbol of whoever left their mark. One thing was clear: whoever was playing this game wasn't afraid of being noted. On the contrary, they wanted my attention. As I walked through the library's corridors, I noticed something curious. The space seemed designed to confuse. The shelves weren't arranged randomly. There was a hidden pattern, an alignment that resembled a chessboard, with symmetries repeating themselves in an almost mathematical way. It wasn't just architecture, it was pure logic. The library itself seemed like a puzzle, as if each wall were part of a larger code. I began mentally mapping the aisles, counting steps and observing angles. I soon realized that when following a certain sequence, I always returned to the same point, as if trapped in an invisible maze. This detail was no coincidence. It was a game of perception, designed to test whoever dared explore beyond the shelves. Whoever designed that place certainly had a purpose: to hide and at the same time reveal. It was both fascinating and disturbing. Imagine entering a space where nothing is quite what it seems, and every shelf could be a calculated detour. It was as if the library itself breathed and led me where it wanted. I began to see the place not as a repository of books, but as a criminal mastermind disguised as architecture. What if the missing book was just one piece within this larger puzzle? In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just investigating a robbery. I was facing a carefully crafted intellectual game, a maze where every step required logic and attention. The library wasn't a setting, it was a character, and somehow it seemed to be on the culprit's side, hiding and protecting its secrets. The challenge was now clear: decipher the space before it decided to swallow me whole. What struck me most about that place wasn't the endless shelves, nor the mystery of the missing book, but the silence. It wasn't the usual silence of a library, but a dense, suffocating, almost physical silence. Every breath felt like a forbidden noise, and even my heartbeat sounded too loud. It was as if the air itself conspired to prevent any secret from being revealed without a price. The further I walked, the more this silence became an unwelcome companion. My footsteps echoed exaggeratedly, multiplied by hallways that returned the distorted sound, as if mocking me. Sometimes I felt like someone was walking behind me, but when I turned, I found only empty hallways. The absence of sound made every shadow more suspicious, every chink of light more menacing. This kind of silence isn't neutral. It affects the mind. Gradually, I began to feel my own deductions being interrupted by this absence of noise, as if my mind were being sucked into a vacuum. That's where the danger lies, when the investigator begins to doubt what is real and what is imaginary. And I had already learned in other cases that the mind can be a maze more treacherous than any physical corridor. Yet the silence also revealed clues to me: a misplaced book, a floorboard that creaked when it shouldn't, a window that let in too much wind. Without noise, every detail seemed to scream at me, and it was in this contrast between absence and excess that I began to notice small contradictions. The silence, after all, wasn't empty. It was full of messages, and it was up to me to interpret them before it was too late. When I gathered the three suspects to hear their stories, I immediately sensed something wasn't adding up. The librarian claimed to have spent the entire night organizing the philosophy section, but his hands showed traces of dust that didn't belong there. The student swore she'd been in the reading room late, but there was no record of her entering at that time. The collector claimed to have left the library early, although a staff member swore they'd seen him later. Contradictory testimonies are like puzzle pieces that don't fit together, yet are still part of the same picture. The more they talked, the more I felt they were hiding something, not necessarily the perpetrator of the crime, but personal secrets they preferred not to reveal. It's in this game of omissions and distortions that the true culprit often camouflages himself, and I needed to figure out who was lying out of necessity and who was lying out of strategy. The curator, who was listening to the conversations, seemed increasingly nervous. With each new version presented, she bit her lip or looked away, as if she already knew the truth, but didn't have the courage to speak it. This posture bothered me, as much as the suspects' contradictions, because sometimes, those who remain silent say more than those who talk too much. Her silence seemed to scream in my ears. By the time I finished listening to everyone, there was no clear line of reasoning, just a jumble of incompatible versions. But for me, this was a sign I was on the right track. Investigations never begin with crystal clear truth. They arise from confusion, from gaps, from stories poorly told, and amidst that chaos of contradictory voices, a certainty grew. Someone was manipulating the narrative to lead me where they want. While rummaging through the shelves, I found something curious. A piece of page, abruptly torn, hidden between two volumes of ancient history. The paper was different, more aged than the others, and bore faded letters that didn't belong in the books it was tucked inside. Picking it up, I sensed it wasn't just a lost fragment, but a hastily torn piece of message. The letters formed incomplete sentences, but loaded with meaning. The key isn't. And then, an abrupt cut. This interruption made me uneasy. Had the culprit left the passage there carelessly, or on purpose? In investigations, I've learned that true clues are never handed to you on a silver platter. They're camouflaged among scraps, noises, and gaps. And that tear seemed more intentional than accidental. I showed the fragment to the curator, and she reacted with barely concealed panic. She said she'd never seen it before, but her voice trembled like a thread about to snap. I kept the manuscript with me, and realized it wasn't just a clue. It was a broken sentence that seemed to want to pull me into a larger labyrinth. Sometimes the most important thing isn't what's written, but what's ripped away.
As I held the paper, I felt I had entered a new level of the game. The missing book wasn't just hidden, it was protected by layers of enigma. Each torn piece, each prolonged silence, was a piece of a puzzle that refused to be put together, and I knew that from that moment on there was no turning back. I had to see it through to the end, no matter. It was at this point in the investigation that I realized something strange. I wasn't just following clues, I was being led by them. Every detail seemed calculated to catch my attention, as if someone knew my way of thinking and was challenging me. It was like looking into a distorted mirror. I saw my own logic reflected, but manipulated. An invisible adversary was playing with me, and I had to decide whether to advance by logic or intuition. I've always believed that logical reasoning is the backbone of any case, but here, each logical step led me down an even more confusing alley, as if the truth were a prize that receded every time I approached it. A mental trap was being constructed, carefully designed to trap me in endless deduction. It was like trying to solve a riddle that changes shape just as you think you've found the answer. At times, I considered that the solution would be to trust my instinct, abandon calculations, and listen only to my investigator's instinct. But how can you differentiate intuition from manipulation when everything around you conspires to confuse you? This duality gnawed at me. Following logic could mean falling into a well-woven web. Trusting instinct could lead me away from the evidence. And between these extremes, my invisible enemy seemed to smile. This dilemma became personal. I was no longer investigating just a stolen book, but myself, my own beliefs, and my limits. The real question wasn't who took the book, but how far would I go to find it? And it was precisely in this conflict that I realized the trap wasn't just in the clues, but within my own mind. When everything seemed too static, I learned to look between the lines for what no one notices. That's how I noticed the invisible trail left by the culprit. Displaced dust in a corner where no one usually passes. Fingerprints, too soft for inattentive eyes. Books discreetly out of order. Small signs that isolated mean nothing, but together form a silent trail. I crouched down in front of a bookshelf and noticed that a sequence of volumes had been hastily rearranged. The titles didn't follow the usual organizational logic, and this could only indicate two things: carelessness or intention. And in that library, carelessness had no place. Whoever had tampered with it was fully aware of what they were doing, and they left behind a nearly invisible thread to be followed. As I examined the floor, I noticed faint shoe prints that abruptly interrupted the passage, as if someone had stopped walking halfway down the hallway. There was no continuation. This intrigued me, because it suggested a different exit, perhaps a hidden passage. It wasn't the first time I'd seen criminals use architectural tricks to disappear without a trace. But here, in the middle of that library, it took on even more symbolic weight. Following this trail, I began to realize that the culprit wasn't just trying to hide the book, but also to test my ability to see the invisible. It was as if every detail had been positioned to provoke me, to gauge my attention. And the more I followed this delicate thread, the clearer it became. There was someone on the other side of this game, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. As I scanned the catalog again, I noticed that the symbols scrawled next to the title formed a curious sequence. Numbers and letters repeated at regular intervals, almost like disguised coordinates. I grabbed my notebook and began to chart the combinations, realizing that this wasn't just a doctored record. It was a mathematical enigma, a code meant to be deciphered by anyone with the patience or the obsession. The pattern resembled the logic of a magic square, where each addition leads to the same result. But here, the results pointed to specific shelf numbers and positions within the library. It was as if someone had transformed the physical space into a puzzle board, where each shelf represented part of the answer. It was ingenious, bold, and at the same time, provocative. I spent hours mentally rearranging the library map, crossing numbers and symbols until a pattern began to form. The sequence pointed to a specific corridor, one that seemed too banal to harbor any mystery. But I've learned not to trust the obvious. Precisely what seems too common is often the key to invisible doors, and something told me there was more to it than dusty book. Upon reaching the indicated corridor, the silence seemed even heavier. I touched the shelves, checked the numbers, followed every detail of the deciphered logic. Everything led to a forgotten section, almost devoid of activity. Their mathematics was not just calculation, but a disguised invitation, and I knew that if I had the courage to follow it to the end, I would find something that would completely change the course of the investigation. Following the riddle's instructions, I approached the bookshelf marked with numbers. At first glance, it was just another shelf, crammed with dusty volumes. But as I pressed one of the books, I heard a discreet click, like the mechanism of an ancient lock. The sound echoed through the silent hallway, and suddenly, the entire bookshelf sagged back a few inches. I had found a hidden passage. The opening revealed a narrow corridor, lit only by cracks that let in the dim light from outside. The air there was more humid, thick with mold and secret. Each step I took made the floor creak as if protesting my presence. It was clear that few, if any other than the culprit, knew this path. It felt like I had stepped through a portal into the very heart of the library. The walls, made of ancient stone, bore signs of wear and tear, revealing centuries of hidden use. It wasn't a makeshift construction, but something planned from the beginning. This left me uneasy. Why would someone, centuries ago, have decided to create secret passages in a library? The answer could only be one: because certain books were never meant to be easily found. I walked to the end of the corridor, and found a narrow door, almost camouflaged by the darkness. Touching it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The secret passage wasn't just a hiding place, it was a message. Whoever built it intended only the most attentive, those who saw beyond the obvious, to reach it. And in that instant, I realized that the book's disappearance was only drawing me deeper into the shadow play. When the secret path revealed itself, all my suspicions began to take shape, and it was precisely there that the mysterious collector ceased to be just an elegant shadow in the corner of the library. I discovered hidden receipts in his name, proving that he had been discreetly funding research into the author of the missing book. It wasn't just a passion for literature, it was an investment in something much greater, something that reeked of power.
I confronted him in his office, and for the first time, he broke his impenetrable pose. His previously cold eyes wavered for a moment. When I showed him the proofs, he said, in a measured tone, that he simply wanted to preserve knowledge. But his speech sounded overly rehearsed. Those who want to preserve knowledge don't hide, manipulate, or disappear entire works. The truth is, he treated the book like a chess piece. Useful, strategic, indispensable. The most revealing detail was his calm. While most people rushed to justify themselves, he spoke slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. This wasn't defensiveness. It was provocation. It was as if he wanted to remind me that he was still in control, even when cornered. People like that don't act on impulse. They act on calculation, and this made him even more dangerous, because it meant I was dealing with someone who was thinking 3 moves ahead. Even though all the evidence pointed to him, something didn't add up. It was too convincing, almost too perfect to be true. And in my experience, culprits who seem obvious are rarely the true perpetrators. In that instant, I realized that perhaps the collector was just a sophisticated diversion, a living alibi to cover up an even more subtle criminal mind. As I pieced together the puzzle, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a crime. There were lives and reputations at stake. If I revealed everything I knew, some people would be destroyed forever, and they might not even be directly responsible. This knowledge weighed heavily on my shoulder. The investigator in me wanted the unvarnished truth, but the man questioned whether certain truths were worth exposing. The dilemma gnawed at me silently. The curator, with her evident nervousness, might be harboring a secret that wasn't criminal but human. The obsessive librarian, with his rituals of order, might only be hiding personal fears. Even the student, driven by curiosity, might have crossed a line without even realizing it. Everyone had a dark side, but does every dark side deserve to be dragged into the light? With each clue I found, I felt like I wasn't just investigating the disappearance of a book, but the limits of morality. What matters more, absolute truth, or the preservation of life? My work has always taught me to seek facts, but there was something about this case that demanded more than logic. It demanded compassion, and I confess, this balance between justice and humanity has always been my weakness. At that moment, I realized that the investigation wasn't just testing me as a professional, but also as a person. It was as if each puzzle forced me to look within myself, confronting my own judgment. And as the weight of the choices grew, one certainty became clear. Any decision I made would have a price, and I could already hear the pieces of the game moving toward the next act. When all the clues pointed to the collector, it was a simple detail that changed everything. Reviewing the entry records again, I noticed a signature disguised between the lines. The student's, but it wasn't her ordinary signature. They were encrypted initials, the same ones used in the catalog symbols. Suddenly, the whole scenario reconfigured. The curious young woman wasn't just a spectator. She was the centerpiece. I remembered her every gesture, the lingering glances, the exaggerated enthusiasm, the overly innocent questions. Everything that seemed naive was in fact an act. She knew the book's author intimately, knew the legend surrounding the work, and most importantly, understood the hidden logic I was deciphering. The collector and the curator were nothing more than smokescreens. The real brain was hidden behind a youthful face. I confronted her discreetly, and her reaction wasn't panic, but relief, as if she'd expected me to reach her. She smiled calmly and said, "It took you longer than I thought, detective." Those words echoed like a punch. The game was never about the book itself, but about my ability to follow each puzzle to its conclusion. I wasn't just the hunter. I was also the prey of the challenge she'd created. At that moment I understood that the investigation didn't end with the discovery of the culprit, but with the revelation of the purpose. The student wasn't seeking wealth or power. She was seeking to prove she could deceive trained minds, including mine, and in a way she succeeded. I had solved the mystery, but I still felt she was the one who emerged victorious. The twist wasn't in the facts, but in the way they were handled. I retrieved the book, but as I leafed through it, I realized it was no ordinary work. Between the pages were marginal notes, diagrams, and instructions so meticulous they read like a manual on human manipulation. Strategies of persuasion, codes of behavior, and even methods for creating perfect alibi. It was like holding a silent bomb, capable of exploding not in walls but in minds. The student, before disappearing into the shadows, told me that it didn't matter who owned the book, because its contents were already alive in those who understood it. That phrase haunted me for days. It was as if she had transferred the true power of the work into her own mind, and that to me was far more dangerous than any page of paper. I was faced with a dilemma: keep the book as evidence or destroy it to prevent it from falling into the wrong hand. I followed protocol, of course, but deep down I wonder to this day if this was the right decision, because certain truths, once revealed, never go back to sleep. And some ideas are more dangerous than weapons. As I left the library, I looked back and felt her still watching me. The silence still reigned, but it no longer felt empty. It was the silence of someone who keeps secrets that will never be fully revealed. And in that moment I realized I had solved the case, but I was nowhere near finished with the story. At the end of that investigation, I realized that the real mystery lay not just in the missing book, but in the choices each of us makes when faced with the unknown. Logic led me to the truth, but it was reflecting on human limits that made me understand the true weight of that story. Some answers lie not in the pages, but within us. I learned that certain secrets can be as dangerous as weapons, because they silently shape our decisions. And deep down, every enigma is a mirror. It not only reveals the culprit, but forces us to see our own shadow. What we do with this discovery is what truly defines the course of our lives. So I ask you, if you were in my shoes, how far would you go in search of the truth? Is it worth exposing everything, even if it costs lives and reputations? Or is there wisdom in protecting what should not be revealed? Sometimes the greatest challenge isn't deciphering the enigma, but bearing the weight of the answer. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your comment. This way you'll stay up to date with each new investigation I bring to light. And together, we'll continue to unravel the mysteries that logic alone can't explain.